when a little girl calls 911 to ask if her daddy's love is supposed to hurt. It opens the door to a home filled with dangerous secrets, a missing mother, and a truth no child should ever have to carry. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. Samuel Morrison had been the lighthouse keeper of Beacon Point for 17 years, but hadn't truly seen the light in the last 5. You see, my friends, there's a difference between a flame and carrying one in your heart. Samuel had mastered the former while losing touch with the latter entirely. The locals in Millbrook Harbor called him the ghost of Beacon Point, not because he was dead, but because he'd forgotten how to live. Every morning at dawn, he'd climb those 112 steps to check the lens. Every evening at dusk, he'd light the beacon. But between those moments, Samuel existed in a gray space where hope goes toady. His cottage sat at the base of the lighthouse like a faithful dog waiting for its master to come home. Inside, dust collected on picture frames turned face down, and mail piled up unopened because bills and condolences look remarkably similar when you've stopped caring about either. But the ocean, the ocean never stops caring. It had been whispering to Samuel for months, preparing him for what was coming. Because sometimes, my dear listeners, the universe conspires not to break us, but to rebuild us from the ground up. It was Tuesday, October 15th, when Hurricane Helena decided to introduce herself to the Massachusetts coast. Now, hurricanes are like uninvited guests at life's party. They show up when you least expect them, rearrange all your furniture, and somehow leave you with exactly what you needed, even if you didn't know you needed it. Samuel had weathered 37 storms in his lighthouse. This would be his 38th, and approached it with the same mechanical precision he approached everything else. Secure the equipment, stock the emergency supplies, light the beacon early. Wait, but Helena had other plans, at 3:17 a.m., when the wind was howling like all the world's sorrows had found their voice. Samuel heard something that cut through the storm symphony, a sound that made his heart remember how to race. It was the universal distress signal, repeated in desperate Morse code, cutting through the radio static like a prayer finding its way to heaven. S-O-S-S. Oh, Ses. Oh, Ses. This is the merchant vessel Star of Carolina, came the crackling voice. We've lost engine power, taking on water. 23 souls on board, including 8 children on a school trip back from Boston. Can anyone hear us? Can anyone help? And just like that, Samuel Morrison remembered why lighthouse keepers exist. Not just to tend a light, but to be one. In that moment, standing in his lighthouse as the storm raged around him like the end of fuel, Samuel faced a choice that would define not just his night, but his entire reason for being. The safe thing? The protocol thing was to radio the Coast Guard and pray they could reach the Star of Carolina in time. But Samuel knew something the radio dispatcher didn't know. He knew these waters like a musician knows his favorite song. He knew that Hurricane Helena was pushing that ship toward Devil's Teeth, a cluster of jagged rocks that had claimed 17 vessels in the past century. He knew that the Coast Guard, coming from the south, would arrive 15 minutes too late. Also knew that his own boat, his Sarah's Dream, was still seaworthy. Named after Fed Otter he'd lost to leukemia 5 years ago. The reason he'd turned all those pictures face down and stopped opening his mail. Sarah's Dream. He whispered her name for the first time in 2 years, and something inside his chest cracked open like an egg, letting light spill in. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah would have wanted him to try. Sarah would have demanded it. Samuel grabbed his emergency kit, his flares, his radio, and something he hadn't touched in 5 years, Sarah's compass, the one she'd given him for his 50th birthday, with the inscription, so you'll always find your way home to us. As he fired up the Sarah's Dream and pushed into the teeth of Hurricane Helena, Samuel Morrison stopped existing and started living. Asterisk, there's a moment in every hero's journey, and make no mistake, Samuel was becoming a Hereth that night, when the universe tests your resolve, when it asks, are you sure? Are you absolutely certain this is who you want to be? For Samuel, that moment came when he was halfway to the Star of Carolina, and a wave the size of a 3-story building rose up in front of him like a liquid mountain. Time slowed. Heckle turned back. He could radio that he tried, but couldn't make it. No one would blame him. Instead, he gunned the engine and aimed the Sarah's Dream straight up that wall of water, shouting into the wind, I'm coming, baby girl. Daddy's finally coming home. The wave crashed over him, filling his boat with enough ocean to sink most vessels. But the Sarah's Dream had been built by Samuel's own hands 15 years ago, when he still believed in tomorrow. She held together like faith itself, shedding water and rising again, through his radio, crackling with static and hope. This is Beacon Point Lighthouse, Star of Carolina. I see your lights. Hold on, I'm coming for you. The response came back. Faint but clear. Lighthouse keeper, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're taking on water fast. The children, they're scared. Can you really reach us? Samuel looked at Sarah's compass, its needle pointing not north, but toward love, toward purpose, toward the man he'd forgotten he could be. Captain, I've got 23 reasons to reach you and a daughter in heaven making sure I didn't fail. We're going to bring everyone home. Asterisk, what happened in the next hour would be talked about in Millbrook Harbor for generations. How Samuel Morrison, the ghost who'd stopped living 5 years ago, became the guardian Inglewoe, refused to let anyone else die on his watch. One by one, he ferried passengers from the sinking Star of Carolina to his lighthouse. First the eyed children, wide-eyed and clinging to life jackets, but trusting this gruff man who spoke Totham like they were his own. Then the adults, teachers, and chaperones who'd thought the school trip would end in disaster. With each trip through those impossible waves, Samuel felt something returning to him. Not just purpose, but joy. The kind of joy that comes from remembering that you matter, that your life has meaning beyond your own pain. On his final rescue run, as he helped Captain Rodriguez aboard the Sarah's Dream, the captain grabbed his arm. Lighthouse keeper, why? Why risk your life for strangers? Samuel looked back at his lighthouse, its beacon cutting through the storm like a sword of light, and smiled for the first time in 5 years. Because I just remembered something my daughter taught me. Love doesn't end when Simeon dies. It just finds new people to save. Asterisk dawn broke over Beacon Point like applause from heaven itself. Hurricane Helena had moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean, and a lighthouse keeper who'd been reborn in the storm. All 23 souls from the Star of Carolina were safe, wrapped in blankets in Samuelitis, sharing hot coffee. And stories of survival. The children had turned his lamp room into their own private sanctuary, drawing pictures of lighthouses and boats on fogged windows. But the real transformation was in Samuel himself. As he watched these strangers turned family filling his lighthouse with laughter and life, he finally understood what Sarah's compass had been pointing toward all along. Not geographical north, but true north. The direction of love, service, and connection. One of the children, a girl about Sarah's age when she died, tugged on his sleeve. Mr. Lighthouse Man, are you a hero? Samuel knelt down to her level, seeing Sarah's eyes in hers, feeling Sarah's presence in feminine light streaming through the lens above. No, sweetheart. Heroes are people who save others. I'm just a man who finally remembered that being saved and saving others are the same thing. Asterisk in the weeks that followed, letters began arriving at Beacon Point. Not bills or condolences this time, but thank you notes from the families of the Star of Carolina. Pictures drawn by the children he'd rescued. Wedding invitations from a couple who'd met during those terrifying horse in his lighthouse. But it was one letter in particular that changed everything. It came from Dr. Marina Santos, one of the teachers he'd rescued, written on hospital letterhead from Children's Hospital Boston. "Dear Samuel," it began, "I wanted you to know that your rescue didn't just save 23 people that night. It inspired something much bigger. The children haven't stopped talking about the brave lighthouse keeper who showed them what real heroes look like. They've started a club, Sarah's Lights, named after your boat. They visit sick children in the hospital, bringing art supplies and hope. They say they're learning to be lighthouse keepers too, people who help others find their way home. I thought you should know that your Sarah's light didn't go out when she died. It just multiplied. There are now dozens of young lighthouse keepers, spreading her light throughout the city. Thank you for teaching them and reminding me that the best way to honor those we've lost is to love those who are still here." Samuel read that letter 17 times before he finally walked to his mantelpiece and turned Sarah's picture right side up. She was smiling as always, but now he could smile back. Word of Samuel's rescue spread beyond Millbrook Harbor, carried by the wind and the wonder-off people who still believe in heroes. Soon, other lighthouse keepers from up and down the coast began visiting Beacon Point, not just to share stories, but to learn from the man who'd rediscovered his purpose in the middle of a hurricane. Samuel found himself becoming something he'd never expected, a teacher, not of lighthouse maintenance or storm protocols, but of something much more valuable: how to find your way back to yourself when you've lost the map. Every month, he'd host what he called Beacon Nights, gatherings where lighthouse keepers, coast guard officers, fishermen, and anyone who worked on the water could come together to share their stories. His lighthouse became not just a navigation aid for ships, but a gathering place for souls seeking direction. During one particularly meaningful Beacon night, a young Coast Guard officer named David approached Samuel. "Sir, I've heard about your rescue of the Star of Carolina. I wanted to ask you something. I lost me brother in a boating accident last year. I've been thinking about quitting the Coast Guard. Echo's every call reminds me of him. How do you keep going when the job brings back painful memories?" Samuel looked out at the ocean, then back at this young man who reminded him so much of himself. 5 years ago. "Son, I spent 5 years thinking that avoiding the pain would make it go away. But pain isn't the enemy. Paralysis is. Your brother didn't die so you could stop saving people. He died so you could save them with even more art. Because you know exactly how precious every single life is. The pain you carry isn't a burden. It's a compass. It points toward every person who still needs saving." David wiped his eyes and nodded. 6 months later, he'd be credited with saving 43 people during a ferry accident. When reporters asked him what inspired his heroism, he mentioned an old lighthouse keeper who taught him that grief and courage were two sides of the same coin. Asterisk, 2 years after Hurricane Helena, Samuel received a phone call that would complete the circle off his transformation. It was from Captain Rodriguez of the Star of Carolina, which had been salvaged and refitted. "Samuel, my friend, I have news. The Star of Carolina is ready to sail again. But we're not going back to our old cargo routes. We're becoming something new, a floating classroom, taking underprivileged children on educational voyages. Our first trip will be a memorial cruise for Sarah, visiting lighthouses along the coast and teaching children about navigation, hope, and heroism. I was hoping you might consider joining us as our chief instructor. We need someone who understands that the most important navigation happens not with compasses and charts, but with heart and purpose." Samuel looked around his lighthouse. That lighthouse where he'd died and been reborn, where he'd learned that isolation is just another word for forgetting your purpose. Then he looked at Sarah's picture, and in his mind he heard her voice, clear as the beacon above. "Go, Daddy. Go light up the world." 3 months later, Samuel Morrison began his new career as Chief Navigation Instructor aboard the Star of Carolina, educational vessel. But he remained the keeper of Beacon Point Lighthouse, now training a young apprentice named Marcus, a former gang member from Boston who'd been inspired by the stories of the Star of Carolina rescue to change his life. "The light is never just for you," Samuel told Marcus on his first day. "It's for everyone who's still finding their way home." 5 years after Hurricane Helena changed his life, Samuel Morrison stood on the deck of the Star of Carolina as it approached Beacon Point. On board were 40 children from inner-city Boston, part of the Sarah's Lights program that had grown into a nationwide movement. As they drew near the lighthouse, its beam cutting through the twilight like hope made visible, one of the children pointed up at the tower. "Mr. Samuel, is it true that lighthouse keepers can see the future?" Samuel chuckled, thinking of all the futures he'd been part of creating. Marcus, who was no training to become a Coast Guard officer. David, who'd started a grief support group for first responders. The children from the original rescue, many of whom were now teenagers volunteering with Sarah's Lights. The families who'd been reunited because someone decided to risk everything for strangers. "Well," Samuel said, his voice carrying the wisdom of a man who'd learned that redemption isn't something you find, it's something you become. "Lighthouse keepers don't see the future. We help create it. Every time we choose to shine a light instead of cursing the darkness, we're building tomorrow." As the Star of Carolina anchored near Beacon Point, Samuel could see Marcus and Thelida's tower, tending the beacon with the same care Samuel had learned from his own mentor decades ago. The light swept across the water, touching each face on the deck, and Samuel realized that this was how immortality worked, not by living forever, but by lighting fires that outlast you. That night, as they anchored in the calm waters near his lighthouse, Samuel wrote in his journal, "Today I understood something Sarah tried to teach me from the very beginning. Love isn't something we lose when people die. Love is something we become when we choose to let their light shine through our actions. I am no longer Samuel Morrison, the man who lost his daughter. I am Samuel Morrison, the man whose daughter taught him how to save the world, one light at a time." Asterisk, but the story doesn't end there, my friends. No, indeed. It takes a turn that reminds us that the past has a way of completing its own circles, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. It was 7 years after Hurricane Helena when Samuel received a letter that would shake him to his very foundation. The envelope was yellowed with age, postmarked from Portland, Maine, and addressed in handwriting he'd recognize anywhere, even though he hadn't seen it in over 8K. It was from his brother Thomas. Now, Thomas Morrison was a chapter in Samuel's life that he'd firmly closed and locked away. Thomas, the successful shipping magnate who'd never understood why his younger brother Wold chose to tend lighthouses instead of building empires. Thomas, who'd stopped speaking to Samuel after Sarah's funeral, claiming that Samuel's dramatic grief was an embarrassmento, the family name. The letter had been written 3 months before Thomas died, before he'd had the courage to send it. His widow, Margaret, had found it among his papers with specific instructions to deliver it to Samuel when he was ready to hear it. Margaret had attended one of the Sarah's Lights fundraisers in Boston, had heard Samuel speak about redemption and second chances, and decided that 7 years was long enough. With trembling hands, Samuel opened the letter. "Samuel, my brother, my conscience forces me to write what my pride never allowed me to say. I was wrong. Not just about the lighthouse keeping, not just about your grief, but about everything that matters in this world. I spent my life building monuments to my own success while you built bridges to other people's hearts. I have lung cancer, Samuel. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4. Margaret doesn't know I'm writing this, but I needed you to understand something before I die. The night Sarah passed away, I didn't leave your house because I was embarrassed by your tears. I left because I was terrified by them. You loved so deeply, grieved so completely, that it showed me how shallow my own well of feeling had become. I have ships all over the world, Samuel, but not one friend who would shed a tear at my funeral. Not you have a single lighthouse, but you've built a fleet of hearts that carry your light wherever they go. If it's not too late, if pride hasn't poisoned the well completely, I'd like to try to be your brotheragan. Not the successful one, not the older one, just ... your brother. The one who used to climb trees with you and dream about sailing to the edge of the world. Your ship has found its harbor, Samuel. Mine is still searching for shore. Samuel read that letter 17 times, just as he'd done with Dr. Santos's letter years before. But this time, tears weren't enough. He picked up his phone and called. Margaret, it's Samuel. I'd like to visit Thomas's grave, if that's all right. And then, I'd like to tell you some stories about the brother I remember, before life taught us to be strangers. The journey to Portland took Samuel through waters he hadn't navigated in decades, not just physical passage along the coastline aboard the Star of Carolina, but the emotional voyage back to a brotherhood he'd thought was lost forever. Margaret. Morrison met him at Thomas's grave on a hill overlooking Portland Harbor, where Serpentine ships flew their flags at half-mast, not because company policy required it, but because the dock workers and ship captains had insisted. They'd heard about the letter, a Booth brother who'd tried to build bridges after burning them for so long. As Samuel knelt beside Thomas's headstone, something beautiful happened. Margaret began to tell him stories he'd never heard, stories of how Thomas had secretly followed Samuel Scarrier, had framed newspaper clippings about the Hurricane Helena rescue, had magnanimous donations to the Sarah's Lights program for years. He never knew how to say he was proud of you, Margaret whispered, but he kept a lighthouse model on his desk. He called it his North Star, said it reminded him of what really mattered. Samuel placed a small gift beside the headstone, a compass, identical to the one Sarah had given him, engraved with the words, "For my brother Thomas, you found your shore after all." But Margaret had her own surprise for Samuel. She handed him a key, ornate, old-fashioned, clearly important. Thomas left instructions. The Morrison Shipping Company is being dissolved, Samuel. But the proceeds aren't going to charity, and they're not staying in the family. They're being used to create something new, the Thomas Morrison Institute for Maritime Brotherhood. It's a school, Samuel, for lighthouse keepers, Coast Guard officers, and merchant mariners. He wanted it built at Beacon Point, if you'll accept. A partnership. Samuel stared at the key, understanding dawning like a sunrise over his consciousness. He's asking me to teach others what he never learned himself? No, Margaret smiled through her tears. He's asking you to teach them what he finally did learn. That success isn't about how many ships you own, but how many souls you guide safely home. Asterisk construction of the Thomas Morrison Institute began 18 months later, rising from the shores near Beacon Point like a cathedral of learning. The architecture was deliberately humble, not the imposing fortress Thomas might have built in his corporate days, but a series of connected buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, each one oriented to catch the lighthouse beam as it swept across the grounds. Samuel worked with Margaret to design every detail, ensuring that the Institute would embody the lessons both brothers had learned, Thomas through his final humility, Samuel through his rescued purpose. The main hall featured a massive window facing the lighthouse, with Thomas's compass mounted at the center, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward Beacon Point itself, a reminder that true direction comes from service, not success. First class of students arrived on a September morning that seemed painted by angels themselves. 36 souls from around the world, lighthouse keepers from Scotland and Nova Scotia, Coast Guard recruits from 5 different nations, merchant mariners who'd heard of Booth Institute through the maritime network that had grown around Samuel's. Legend. Among them was someone who would become central to the next chapter of our story. A young woman named Elena Vasquez, a marine engineer from Chile whose own tragedy had brought her to Beacon Point. Elena had lost her entire crew when their research vessel foundered in a storm. Off Cape Horn, she'd survived by clinging to debris for 14 hours, guided to safety by the beam of a remote Chilean lighthouse. Like Samuel before his awakening, she'd become consumed with guilt over being the sole survivor. She'd heard about the Institute through the Sarah's Lights network, which had expanded internationally and had traveled 6,000 miles to learn how to transform survival into service. On the first day of classes, Samuel stood before these 36 seekers and spoke words that will be recorded, translated into dozen languages, and eventually carved in stone above the Institute's entrance. You've come here thinking I'm going to teach you about lighthouses and navigation and maritime safety. But that's not why you're really here. You're here because somewhere in your journey, you learned that being saved and saving others are not separate experiences. They're two faces of the same sacred coin. My brother Thomas spent his life learning that lesson fared way. He left this institute as his final testament that redemption is always possible. Forgiveness is always available, and it's never too late to choose love over pride. Elena Vasquez was unlike any student Samuel had encountered. While others focused on technical skills or emotional healing, she seemed driven by a question that consumed her. How do we create systems of rescue that don't depend on individual heroism? She'd noticed something that Samuel, in his focus on personal transformation, had missed. The current maritime rescue system was reactive. Lighthouses and coast guards responded to emergencies after they happened. But Elena envisioned something revolutionary, a proactive network that could predict and prevent disasters before they occurred. During her 3rd month at the Institute, she approached Samuel with a proposal that would change everything. Professor Morrison, she said, using the title Samuel had never grown comfortable with. What if we could create a network of lighthouses that didn't just guide ships, but actually communicated with them? What if every lighthouse along a coast could share information about weather, currents, and hazards in real time? What if we could build a system where no ship ever faces a storm alone? Samuel listened, fascinated, as Elena outlined her vision. A connected network of lighthouses, each equipped with advanced weather monitoring, satellite communication, and predictive idling systems. Ships would receive not just guidance to safe harbor, but advance warning off every possible danger along their route. It's beautiful, Elena, Samuel said, but the cost would be enormous. The technology alone would bankrupt the Institute. Elena smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd been hoping he'd raise that exact objection. Not if we make it global. Not if every maritime nation contributes. Not if we prove that prevention saves more money than rescue operations ever could. And then she showed him the letter she'd been writing, responses from lighthouse authorities in Norway, Japan, Australia, South Africa. The entire maritime world, it seemed, was ready for Elena's revolution. Within 6 months, the Global Lighthouse Network was born, with the Thomas Morrison Institute as its headquarters and Elena Vasquez as its first director of predictive maritime. Safety. 3 years later, Samuel stood in the Institute's new communication center, watching Elena coordinate with lighthouse keepers from 5 continents. The massive display screens showed real-time data from over 2,000 lighthouses worldwide, each one sharing information that helped ships navigate safely across the world's oceans. The system had already prevented 43 disasters, saved Over 800 lives, and proven that Elena's vision was more than just idealistic dreaming. It was the future of Maritimesifi. But what moved Samuel most wasn't the technology or the statistics. It was watching Elena work with the same passionate dedication he'd once seen in himself. During Hurricane Helena, she'd transformed her survival guilt into a mission to ensure no one else would have to cling to debris in a storm, hoping for rescue. "You know what you've built here, don't you?" Samuel asked her one evening as they watched the lighthouse beams sweep across the harbor. "A better warning system." Elena replied, though her smile suggested she knew he meant something deeper. "You've built Thomas's dream and my dream and Sarah's dream all into one thing. A way for people to take care of each other before they need saving. A way to turn every lighthouse keeper into a guardian angel for sailors they'll never meet." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the data streams flow across her monitors, each one representing a lighthouse keeper somewhere in the world, sharing information that might save lives thousands of miles away. "Professor, can I tell you something? I used to think that surviving when my crew died was a punishment, like I was supposed to carry their deaths as my burden forever. But working here, building this network, I finally understand that surviving wasn't my punishment. It was my assignment. They died so I could learn how to prevent other people from dying." Samuel felt tears welling up, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. He was looking at himself from 8 years ago, but Elena had learned in 3 years what it had taken him decades to understand. "Elena," he said, "I want to offer you something. The directorship of the entire institute. You've proven that you understand not just how to save people, but how to create systems that multiply salvation exponentially." She turned to look at him, startled. "But this is your life's work, Professor. This is Sarah's legacy." Samuel smiled, thinking of his daughter, his brother, all the people who'd taught him that legacy isn't what you hold on to, it's what you pass forward. "No, Elena. Sarah's legacy is what you're building. And Thomas's legacy is what you're proving. That it's never too late to choose service over success, connection over competition. The Institute needs a leader who sees the future, not just the past. It needs you." 6 months later, the first International Lighthouse Keepers Conference convened at Beacon Point. 1,500 maritime professionals from 93 countries gathered to share knowledge, celebrate innovations, and honor the traditions that had guided sailors safely home for centuries. But this conference was different from any that had come before. Instead of focusing solely on technical improvements or historical preservation, the entire event was organized around Elena's revolutionary concept, collaborative illumination, the idea that lighthouses were most powerful not as individual beacons, but as nodes in a global network of mutual support. Samuel delivered the opening keynote, but his speech wasn't about his own journey or even the Hurricane Helena rescue that had made him famous. Instead, he spoke about the future Elena is building. "My friends, we stand at a threshold. For thousands of years, lighthouse keepers have been solitary guardians, tending our lights in isolation, doing our part to guide ships safely home. But Elena Vasquez has shown us that our future lies not in isolation, but in connection. Not in individual heroism, but in collective wisdom. The Global Lighthouse Network has proven that when lighthouse keepers share information, when we coordinate our efforts, when we treat the world's oceans as a single community rather than separate territories, we don't just save more lives. We create a web of safety that makes rescue unnecessary. Today, we're not just lighthouse keepers. We're members of the world's first truly global emergency response system. And every beam of light we tend reaches not just the ships in our local waters, but contributes to the safety of vessels on every ocean. The conference's most powerful moment came during the memorial beam ceremony. At sunset, as lighthouse keepers around the world synchronized their beacons for Sarah's minute, Elena activated a new feature of the global network, The Remembrance. Protocol. For 60 seconds, every lighthouse connected to the network pulsed in a pattern that told history of every life lost at sea in the previous year. Each pulse represented someone's daughter, someone's brother, someone's friend who hadn't made it home. But more than a memorial, it was a promise, a commitment from lighthouse keepers worldwide that those deaths would inform their work, inspire their dedication, and remind them why their seemingly simple job offending lights was actually the sacred work of preserving life itself. As the memorial concluded, something unprecedented happened. Fishing vessels, merchant ships, naval vessels, and pleasure craft all over the world began flashing their own lights in response. Captains who'd never met the lighthouse keepers who'd guided them safely home were joining the ceremony, adding their voices to the global chorus of gratitude. For the first time in maritime history, the entire ocean seemed to be speaking with one voice. We see your light. We appreciate your service. We are all part of the same community of soul seeking safe passage home. It was during the conference's final day that Elena received a message that would reshape her understanding of her own journey. A telegram. Yes, people still occasionally sent telegrams to lighthouse stations, arrived addressed to Elena Vasquez, survivor of the Esperanza del Mar, Beacon Point, Massachusetts. Elena's hands trembled as she read it. The Esperanza del Mar was the research vessel where her crew had died. She'd never spoken publicly about the ship's name, had never connected Herpes tragedy to her present work in any official capacity. How could anyone know? The telegram was from Captain Roberto Mendoza, Chilean Navy. Senorita Vasquez, I was the rescue coordinator who searched for your vessel 8 years ago. We never found your crew, but your survival led to changes in our search protocols. Your work with the global network has now saved Chilean vessels 17 times. Your crew's sacrifice was not in vain. They guided you to this purpose. Please accept an invitation to be guest of honor at the dedication of the Esperanza del Mar Memorial Lighthouse next month. Your crewmates' names will be inscribed in the beacon that guides ships safely through the waters where they died. Elena read the telegram 7 times before she fully absorbed its meaning. The lighthouse clung to during those 14 hours in the water. The light that had saved her life was being renamed to honor the crew she'd lost. More than that, the same waters that had taken their lives would now be protected by a lighthouse bearing their names. Equipped with the global network technology she developed, Samuel found her sitting on the beach behind the Institute, holding the telegram and staring out at the horizon. They're becoming lighthouse keepers too, she said quietly. My crew, they're going to help guide people home, even though they never made it home themselves. Samuel sat beside her on the sand, understanding exactly what she meant. Elena, do you know why I really wanted you to take over the Institute? She shook her head. Because you've learned what it took me decades to understand. The people we lose don't stop saving lives when they die. They just do it through us. Your crew is saving people through the network you built. Sarah saves people through the programs that bear her name. Thomas saves people through the institute he funded. We're not just lighthouse keepers. We're the hands and hearts of everyone we've ever loved, continuing their work of guiding souls safely home. 1 month later, Elena stood on the rocky coast of Chile as the Esperanza del Mar Memorial Lighthouse was officially dedicated. The beacon had been built exactly where she'd washed ashore 8 years earlier, its beam designed to sweep the treacherous waters where her crew had died. But this wasn't just a memorial. It was a fully functional station in the global lighthouse network, equipped with the most advanced predictive weather systems, satellite communication areas, and automated warning protocols. Ships approaching these waters would receive detailed information about currents, wind patterns, and potential hazards hours before encountering them. As Elena pressed the button that lit the beacon for the first time, she spoke the names of her list. Crewmates into the ocean wind: Miguel Santos, chief engineer; Maria Rodriguez, marine biologist; Carlos Vega, navigator; Ana Torres, communications officer; Pablo Morales, research assistant. With each name, the lighthouse beam pulsed once, and something extraordinary happened. Ships throughout the harbor, fishing boats, cargo vessels, naval ships, began flashing their own lights in response. One pulse for each name, one acknowledgement for each life that would know help protect others. The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Captain Mendoza presented Elena with the lighthouse's operational logbook. The first entry, written in his careful handwriting, read, Day 1, Esperanza del Mar Memorial Lighthouse operational. 5 souls lost here now stand watch to protect all who follow. Their light lives on through the hands of the one they saved. Elena made the second entry. Day, Evening watch. Elena Vasquez, survivor and guardian. I promise you, my friends, that every ship we guide safely home will be our way of honoring your final voyage. Your deaths taught me how to save lives. Now your lighthouse will save the lives I cannot reach alone. That night, as Elena kept her first watch at the Memorial Lighthouse, she received a messagethera of the global network that brought her to tears. Lighthouse keepers from around the world had coordinated to send a message of support. Welcome home, Keeper Elena. Your cruise light shines in all our beacons tonight. For the first time since the night of the storm, Elena felt truly at peace. She hadn't just survived. She'd transformed survival into service, memory into mission, and loss into a legacy that would guide countless souls safely through the darkness. Asterisk. Elena's story could end there, with her finding peace and purpose at the Memorial Lighthouse. But life has a way of demanding even more from those who've already given everything. And Elena's greatest test was yet to come. It happened on a night that seemed designed by fate itself to mirror the storm that had changed her life. 8 years to the day after the Esperanza del Mar had foundered, Hurricane Catalina, a Category 4 monster, bore down on the Chilean coast with winds that made Helena look like a gentle breeze. Elena was manning the Memorial Lighthouse alone, having insisted that her assistant evacuated the other coastal residents. She'd equipped the lighthouse with emergency protocols, backup power systems, and communication arrays that should have made it the safest place on the coast during a hurricane. Should have. At 2:43 a.m. As Catalina's eyewall approached, Elena received a distress signal that made her blood run cold. Mayday, mayday, this is the research vessel Nueva Esperanza. We've lost engine power in heavy seas. 5 researchers aboard, including a student science team. GPS shows we're drifting toward the rocks where the Esperanza del Mar was lost. Can anyone hear us? Elena stared at her radio in disbelief. Another research vessel, another storm. The same waters. Even the name, Nueva Esperanza, New Hope, seemed like the universe was asking her to relive her worst nightmare or transform it into her greatest triumph. Through her global network communications, Elena could see the vessel's position. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the storm surge would dash them against the rocks. The Chilean Coast Guard was responding, but their nearest cutter was 40 minutes away. The helicopterisk team was grounded due to the hurricane-force winds. Elena looked up at the lighthouse beam cutting through the storm and heard her crew's voices as clearly as if they were standing beside her. Go, Elena, go save them. Let us help. For the second time in her life, Elena abandoned the safety of shore and sailed directly into the heart of a hurricane. Asterisk. The lifeboat Elena launched into Hurricane Catalina was a far cry from the debris she'd clung to 8 years earlier. Equipped with GPS navigation, emergency beacons, and direct communication to the global lighthouse network, she had advantages that her younger self called never have imagined. But she also had something even more valuable, the absolute certainty that some storms are meant to be faced, not fled from. As she fought through waves that seemed determined to claim another research vessel in these cursed waters, Elena found herself speaking aloud to her lost crew. Miguel, I need your engineering skills to keep this engine running. Maria, help me read these waters like you read ocean currents. Carlos, guide me to them the way you guided us through 100 safe voyages. Ana, keep the communications clear. Pablo, help me remember why our search matters enough to risk everything. 4. And incredibly, impossibly, it felt like they were there. Every time the engine sputtered, she seemed to know exactly which valve to adjust. Every time a wave threatened to capsize her boat, she found herself making navigational decisions with Magel's engineering intuition, Carlos's seamanship, Maria's understanding of ocean dynamics. Through her radio, she could hear Samuel's voice from Beacon Point, where he was coordinating with the global network to provide real-time weather data. Elena, the storm's eye is going to pass right over you in 12 minutes. That's your window. The seas will calm, the winds will drop, but you'll only have about 6 minutes before the back wall hits. Copy, Samuel. I see the Nueva Esperanza. They're taking on water, but they're still afloat. I'm going to try to get close enough for a rescue line. What happened next would be studied by maritime rescue services for decades to come. Elena managed to navigate through hurricane-force winds to reach the research vessel just as the storm passed over them. In the eerie calm of the hurricane's center, with stars visibly overhead, while walls of storm clouds towered around them, she executed a rescue that saved 5 lives, including Dr. Carmen Silva, a young marine biologist, who reminded Elena powerfully of herself at that age. But the rescue almost failed in its final moments. As Elena's boat pulled away from the sinking Nueva Esperanza, a massive wave from the storm's back wall crashed over both vessels. Elena found herself in the water again, just as she had 8 years earlier, but this time she wasn't alone. This time she was responsible for 5 other people's lives. And this time, instead of clinging to debris and hoping for rescue, Elena became the rescue, using skills she'd learned during her years at the Institute, knowledge gained from the global network, about ocean survival, and something deeper, a strength borrowed from every soul she ever tried to save. Elena managed to keep her rescue party together until the Chilean Coast Guard could reach them. When they were finally pulled aboard the rescue cutter, Dr. Silva gripped Elena's hand with the desperate gratitude of someone who just looked death in the eye and been pulled back from the edge. You saved us, she whispered. How did you know? How did you find us in that storm? Elena looked back toward the memorial lighthouse, its beams still cutting through the hurricane's fury, and smiled. I had help, she said. Sometimes the people we lose become the light that helps us save others. And so, my friends, we return to where we began, with the understanding that some stories don't end, they just keep growing, lighting new paths for new travelers who need guidance home. Samuel Morrison retired from active teaching 2 years after Elena's heroic rescue during Hurricane Catalina, but he remains at Beacon Point as the Institute's Director Emeritus, spending his days mentoring young lighthouse keepers and his evenings writing letters to hundreds of people whose lives have been touched by the lights they tend. Elena Vasquez now directs both the Thomas Morrison Institute and the Global Lighthouse Network, which has grown to include over 4,000 lighthouses on every continent. The network has prevented over 300 maritime disasters and saved more than 10,000 lives. But Elena measures her success differently. She counts the number of people who have learned to transform their survival into service. They're paying into purpose. The Esperanza del Mar Memorial Lighthouse has become a pilgrimage site for maritime professionals from around the world. Its visitors' book contains entries in 47 languages, but they all say essentially the same thing. Thank you for showing us that those we love continue to guide us home. Dr. Carmen Silva, the marine biologist Elena, rescued during hurricane. Catalina now runs the Institute's research division, studying how lighthouse networks can be used to protect marine ecosystems as well as human lives. She often says that Elena didn't just save her from drowning, she saved her from a life without purpose. The Sarah's Lights program has evolved into a global movement, with chapters in 63 countries. Children who've been touched by this program grow up understanding that they are not just future lighthouse keepers, but present-day bearers of light for anyone who might be lost in darkness. Every year, on the anniversary of Hurricane Helena, lighthouse keepers around the world still synchronize. They're beacons for Sarah's Minute. But it's no longer just a memorial. It's a celebration. A recognition that light shared is light multiplied, that rescue given is rescue received, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to become the kind of people they would be proud to have saved. Margaret Morrison established the Thomas Morrison Foundation for Maritime Brotherhood before her death, ensuring that the Institute will continue training lighthouse keepers for generations to come. Her final gift was a letter to Elena. My husband learned too late that success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you illuminate. You are his true legacy, the proof that it's never too late to choose love over pride, service over self. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this ever-expanding story is what happened just last month. Samuel Morrison, now 73 years old, received a visitor at Beacon Point, a young man named David Morrison, Thomas's grandson, who had grown up hearing stories about his uncle the lighthouse keeper and had decided to follow in Samuel's footsteps rather than his grandfather's. Uncle Samuel, David said, using a title that bridged decades of family separation. I want Toller now to tend a light, not for the money or the prestige, but because I think maybe it's time our family learned how to guide people home instead of just building ships. Samuel looked at this young man, Thomas's grandson, Sarah's honorary cousin, the next generation of Morrisons who would carry forward the work of illumination, and felt a circle completing itself. Then welcome home, nephew, Samuel said, handing David the compass that Sarah had given him so many years ago. Your grandfather and your cousin are waiting to teach you everything they know about finding your way to the light. And so the story continues, my friends. Not because I'm extending it, but because stories like this don't have endings. They have new beginnings. Somewhere tonight, there's a lighthouse keeper tending a beacon that will guide a ship safely home. Somewhere tonight, there's a young person learning that survival and service are two names for the same sacred calling. Somewhere tonight, there's someone who feels lost in the darkness, about to discover that they need to find the light. They need to become it. The beacon still shines at Beacon Point, cutting through whatever darkness the night brings. The global lighthouse network continues to grow, connecting keepers and ships and soul sacrifice every ocean on Earth. The Institute continues to train new generations of guardians, teaching them not just how to tend lights, but how to be lights. And in lighthouses around the world, keepers trained by Samuel Morrison and Elena Vasquez continue their work, proving every single day that one person's decision to choose service over safety, connection over isolation, hope over despair, can quite literally light up the world. Samuel Morrison learned that the darkest nights often produce the brightest lights. Elena Vasquez learned that sometimes you have to sail directly into the storm to discover what you're literally made of. Thomas Morrison learned that it's never too late to choose love over pride. Sarah Morrison taught them all that love doesn't end with loss. It just finds new ways to illuminate the world. You see, my dear listeners, we are all lighthouse keepers in our own way. Each of us has a light to tend, a beacon that can guide others safely home. The question isn't whether you have a light to shine. The question is whether you'll choose to let it burn bright. whether you'll join the great work of souls who've decided that the best response to darkness is not to curse it, but to kindle a flame that others can see. The storm that nearly destroyed Samuel Morrison became the wave that carried him home to himself. The tragedy that broke Elena Vasquez became the strength that let her save others. The pride that isolated Thomas Morrison became the humility that built bridges for future generations. And that, my friends, is the most beautiful kind of rescue of all. When saving others teaches Yahoo to save yourself, when loss becomes the foundation for love, when endings become a beginnings, and when the light you tend becomes part of an eternal network of illumination that will guide souls safely home long after your own watch has ended. The light never dies. It just finds new hands to tend it, new hearts to kindle it, new souls to carry it forward into whatever storms may come. So sleep well, and may your own light shine bright tomorrow. May you remember that every act of kindness is a beacon, every moment of courage is a lighthouse, and every choice to love instead of fear adds another lamp to the great network of light that connects us all. The beacon still shines. The watch continues. And somewhere in the darkness, someone is finding their way home because you chose to let your light burn bright. This is the way of lighthouse keepers. This is the way of souls who understand that we are not just rescued. We are rescuers. Not just saved, we are saviors. Not just guided home, we air guides for others seeking the same safe harbor. The light never dies. It only grows brighter. And the story continues in every heart that chooses hope over fear, service over self, and light over darkness. May it continue through you. But before I close this chronicle, let me share with you one final tale. The story of how this very story came to be told, for it too bears the mark of lighthouse keeper's magic. 5 years ago, I was not the storyteller you hear before you now. I was Dr. James Whitmore, a reader literature professor from Boston University, spending my twilight years in a cottage by Thesia, bitter and alone, convinced that the world had forgotten the art of meaningful narrative. I'd spent 40 years teaching young minds about the power of story, only to watch literature slowly in the age of instant everything. I came to Beacon Point not seeking inspiration, but seeking isolation. I'd rented a small cottage near the lighthouse for what I thought would be my final winter, a place to finish my memoirs and, perhaps, find some peace before joining my late wife Catherine in whatever lies beyond. But the lighthouse had other plans. It was during my 3rd week in that cottage when I encountered Samuel Morrison for the first time. I'd been walking the shore, grumbling about the constant pulse of the lighthouse being disrupting my attempt to read, when I nearly collided with an elderly man carrying a compass and wearing the weathered jacket of someone who'd spent decades battling storms. "Beautiful evening," he said, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee rather than strangers in a windswept beach. "I suppose," I replied, in the tone of a man who'd forgotten how to find beauty in anything, though I wished that lighthouse weren't quite so persistent. Samuel laughed, a sound like waves rolling over smooth stones. "Professor, that lighthouse isn't trying to disturb your reading. It's trying to remind you what reading is really for." I stopped walking. "How did you know I was a professor?" "Same way I knew you were a widower who's forgotten why stories matter. Same way I knew you came here thinking you wanted to be alone, when what you really want is to remember how to feel connected to something larger than your own grief." I stared at this stranger who seemed to read me like an open book. "I'm Samuel Morrison," he continued, "keeper of this lighthouse. And unless I'm much mistaken, you're exactly the person we've been waiting for." "We?" Samuel pointed up at the lighthouse beam as it swept over us. "Stories have a way of finding the people who need to tell them, Professor. And I've got a story that's been looking for the right voice to share it with the world." That night, Samuel invited me to the lighthouse for what he called a simple cup of coffee, and a short tale. I arrived expecting perhaps an hour of polite conversation with a local character. I stayed until dawn, mesmerized by the story you've just heard, the story of his transformation, of Elena's courage, of Thomas's redemption, of Sarah's enduring light. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked as the sun rose over Beacon Point. Samuel smiled, handing me a worn notebook filled with his handwriting. "Because stories aren't meant to stay locked in one person's memory, Professor. They're meant to be shared, to inspire, to light the way for others who might be lost in their own storms. You spent 40 years teaching people about the power of narrative. Now it's time to use that knowledge to share a story that could change lives." I took the notebook with trembling hands, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose. "But I'm just a retired professor. I'm not a real storyteller." "Professor Whitmore," Samuel said, and in that moment his voice carried the wisdom of Simeon, who'd learned to see through life's deepest illusions. "Every person who's ever been broken and rebuilt, every soul who's learned to transform pain into purpose, every heart that's discovered love doesn't end with loss. They're all storytellers. The question isn't whether you're qualified to tell this story. The question is whether you're brave enough to let this story transform you in the telling." Over the following months, I spent countless hours with Samuel, with Elena, with the students at the Institute, with the volunteers from Sarah's Lights. I interviewed lighthouse keepers from around the world, spoke with the survivors of the Star, of Carolina Rescue, corresponded with Thomas's widow Margaret before her death. But something extraordinary happened as I researched and wrote. The story began to change me. Samuel's journey from despair to purpose became my own journey from bitterness to hope. Elena's transformation of tragedy into service taught me how to honor Catherine's memory by serving something larger than my own grief. I discovered that you cannot tell a story about the power of light without becoming yourself a bearer of that light. 6 months into the project, I received a letter that would complete my own transformation. It was from Dr. Carmen Silva, the marine biologist Elena had rescued during Hurricane Catalina. "Dear Professor Whitmore, Elena told me about the book you're writing, and I wanted to share something with you. Before the storm that changed my life, I was planning to quit marine biology. I felt my research was meaningless, that I was wasting my life studying creatures that lived in depths no human would ever see. But being rescued by Elena, seeing her courage, understanding her story, made me realize that the depth is where the most important discoveries happen, not just in the ocean, but in human souls. Your book about lighthouse keepers has already begun. Changing lives, Professor, and you haven't even finished writing it yet. Elena carries your interviews like lighthouse beams, sharing Samuel's wisdom with every new student at the Institute. You think you're just documenting their story, but you're actually extending it. You're becoming part of the chain of light that connects every soul who's learned to transform darkness into illumination. Thank you for helping me understand that research matters not because it's seen, but because it serves. Thank you for showing me that the deepest waters often hold the greatest treasures." I read that letter 17 times, just as Samuel had read so many letters that changed his life. And in that moment, I understood what Samuel had been trying to teach me from the very beginning. We don't choose the stories we tell. The stories choose us. And in the telling, we become part of the story ourselves. The book that emerged from those months of research and writing became more than I had ever imagined possible. The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret was published by a small press that specialized in stories of human transformation. I expected modest sales, perhaps a few positive reviews from maritime publications. Instead, the book found its way into the hands of exactly the people who needed to read it. Lighthouse keepers began sharing it with their communities. Coast Guard stations started using it in their training programs. Grief counselors began recommending it to clients who'd lost loved ones. Teachers discovered it offered profound lessons about resilience and service. Most remarkably, the book began inspiring real-world action. Readers started their own Ceres Lights chapters in communities far from any ocean. Maritime safety programs adopted Alana's collaborative approach to emergency prevention. Young people began choosing careers in lighthouse keeping, drawn by the idea of service rather than simply employment. The story, in other words, became what all great stories aspire to become. Not just entertainment, but transformation. Not just narrative, but navigation. And I became what I never expected to become in the final chapter of my life. Not just a readered professor remembering past glories, but an active participant in the ongoing story of human connection and service. Today, at the age of 78, I spend my days not in isolation, but in collaboration. I work with the Thomas Morrison Institute to document the stories of lighthouse keepers around Fjord. I correspond with readers who've been inspired to transform their own darkness into light. I visit schools and community centers, sharing Samuel's story and watching young faces light up with the understanding that they, too, can be lighthouse keepers in their own communities. Catherine would be proud, I think. Not because I've achieved fame or fortune. The book's success has been modest by commercial standards, but because I've learned what she tried to teach me during our 43 years of marriage. That love multiplies when it's shared, that stories gain power when they're told with purpose, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to become the kind of person they believed we could be. So you see, my friends, this story of lighthouse keepers has become a lighthouse itself, a beacon that continues to guide new souls toward understanding their own capacity for service, transformation, and hope. Every time someone reads about Samuel's rescue of the Star of Carolina and decides to help a neighbor in need, the story continues. Every time someone learns about Elena's transformation of tragedy into the global lighthouse network and chooses to turn their own pain into purpose, the story grows brighter. Every time someone discovers that Thomas Morrison's pride became a humility, and his humility became legacy, the story finds new hands to tend it. And every time someone realizes that they, too, can be a lighthouse keeper, tending whatever light they've been given, sharing whatever wisdom they've gained, offering whatever service they're capable of providing, the story becomes not just something they've read, but something they're living. This, then, is the final lesson of the lighthouse keepers. Stories don't end when the last word is spoken. They end when the last person stops living the truth they contain. They end when fellest soul stops believing that darkness can be transformed into light, that isolation can become a connection, that despair can become hope. But as long as there are people willing to tend the lights, whether in actual lighthouses or in the lighthouse of the human heart, the story continues. As long as there are souls who understand that we are all both rescued and rescuer, both saved and savior, both guided home and guides for others seeking safe harbor, the beacon never dims, the light never dies, my friends. It only finds new voices to tell its story, new hearts to carry its message, new souls to kindle its eternal flame. May you be among them. May this story become your story. May the light you tend become part of the great network of illumination that connects every soul who's ever chosen hope over despair, service over self, love over fear. The beacon still shines. The watch continues. And the story lives on in every heart brave enough to believe that one person's light can illuminate the entire world. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting this story find its way to you. And thank you in advance for all the ways you'll make it your own, all the lights you'll kindle, all the souls you'll guide safely home. The night is ending. The dawn is breaking. And somewhere, in a lighthouse that needs your care, a beacon is waiting for you to tend it. Go well, lighthouse keepers. Go light the world.